And now let's tell you about China's new old foreign minister. I say this because he held the post before Xinjiang and he's been reappointed today. When the announcement was made, Wang Yi was in South Africa for a BRICS meeting. And on the sidelines, he met Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor of India. What followed was a predictable pattern. India stated its position. Doval said China's aggression at the border has eroded trust, and the relationship cannot go back to normal until the border tensions are eased. And what did China say? Well, the same old spiel. The border is not a key issue. It is just one aspect of the relationship. It should not compromise India-China ties. The Chinese have always said this. Ignore the troops at the border. Let's talk business instead. So we're basically going around in circles. But that's not what our story is about. Tonight, we want to focus on a Chinese statement. Beijing has made a big claim. It is about Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. China says they spoke last year and they reached some kind of consensus. That's the word they used, consensus. In fact, let me quote from the statement. At the end of last year, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi reached an important consensus on stabilizing China-India relations in Bali. What are the Chinese talking about? They are referring to last year's G20 Summit. It was hosted by Indonesia. There was a dinner for G20 leaders. Both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi were present. They met briefly. It wasn't a sit down. This was the moment, what you see on your screen. The video doesn't tell us very much. We can see the leaders talking, but it's not clear what they said to each other. It appears to be a brief and informal interaction. But Beijing is now offering a very different version. China says there was consensus to restore ties. And what does New Delhi say about this? Well, they're sticking to their old version. According to the Ministry of External Affairs, the leaders just exchanged pleasantries, nothing more than that. Listen to the statement they made after the encounter in Bali.
With regard to the question relating to the handshake between the Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping, I will only say that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, who were both attending the G20 dinner yesterday, hosted by the Indonesian President, exchanged courtesies at the conclusion of the dinner.
So according to India, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping have not spoken to each other since 2020. It shows how the relationship has suffered. It's a major shift from the days of informal summits when China hosted Prime Minister Modi in Wuhan and India reciprocated by hosting Xi Jinping in Varanasi and Mamallapuram. But in the last 3 years, there has been a total freeze in high-level contact. So why is China claiming consensus? How can you achieve a quote-unquote important consensus on such a complex issue in such a brief interaction? China's claims seem to be like a distraction, a way to divert attention from the real issue, which is the Chinese soldiers on the Indian border. There are 50,000 of them. According to one estimate, 50,000 Chinese soldiers. Is China planning to reduce those numbers? By the looks of it, no, they're not. Let's go back to their statement. What does it say about troop withdrawal? Well, nothing. I'll quote again. It says India and China should focus on consensus and cooperation, overcome interference and difficulties, and promote the return of bilateral relations to the track of healthy and stable development at an early date. Contrast this with India's statement. It only talks about the situation at the border. I'm quoting again. During the meeting, NSA conveyed that the situation along the LAC in the western sector of the India-China boundary since 2020 had eroded strategic trust and the public and political basis of the relationship. The statement calls the standoff, quote-unquote, an impediment to normalcy. Strong words. But they haven't moved the needle with Beijing. For 3 years now, India and China have been locked in this face-off. Yes, there has been some disengagement, but a complete de-escalation still remains a long shot. There have been many rounds of military dialogue. The two armies met for the first time in June 2020. Since then, they've met some 18 times, 18 meetings, but the border remains an unresolved issue. At least 2 friction points still remain, Depsang and Demchok. Reports say in these areas, the Chinese side has tried to block Indian patrols, but the Indian troops have not pulled back. Just like the Chinese, they remain firmly entrenched. Meanwhile, Beijing continues to ramp up infrastructure. There are reports of a Chinese bridge in Pangong So. This is the same region where Indian and Chinese troops clashed in the year 2020. China is building a bridge there now. There's a lot of activity. China has added many roads, bridges, and new military bases along the border. In case of a conflict, such infrastructure is critical. It can speed up supplies of weapons and troops to the border. It can be the difference between victory and loss in a war. And China has a lead in this game by many decades. India is trying to catch up. It is building a new road in the north bank of Pangong So. It should be completed by 2025. India is also making an infrastructure push on many other fronts. New roads, new bridges and tunnels are being added to make remote areas more accessible. In the last 2 years, more than 200 such projects have been completed. Another 176 projects are in the pipeline on the Indian side. Today's engagement reaffirms the need for all of this. The Chinese are not going anywhere. They will distract and deceive. India must be prepared for their next move.